Every game is a miracle. Of all the game developers I've had the opportunity to interview, each has told me some form of that statement. Making games is hard, but sometimes, no matter how much effort is put into making one, it just doesn't reach the finish line the way the developer had hoped. As the games industry has become more and more profit-driven, the amount of incomplete games has risen drastically in the last 10 years. There are seemingly more high-profile games that have been rushed out the door to be finished with patches later than ever before. Recently, I was playing Life is Strange Double Exposure, and was shocked to find what I believe is yet another blatantly unfinished game. So I asked myself, why? Why are there so many unfinished games now? In my research, I realized that the answer is actually quite complicated, and today I want to talk about the ways the games industry has changed that have led to the normalization of broken, incomplete products. I also want to teach you how to identify a potentially unfinished game, because they aren't always as easy to spot as you think. This is why unfinished games are everywhere. The truth is that unfinished games have always existed, but the reason there are more of them now is simply because the industry is bigger than it ever has been. The endless pursuit of profit, coupled with the scaling complexity of games, has created the perfect conditions for unstable releases. So, how did we get here? What changed about the industry in terms of technology that put us in this position? As always, understanding something that's currently happening in the games industry requires a bit of a history lesson. In the 70s and 80s, you could only play games through physical media. That meant that when a developer shipped a game, that was it. The data on a cartridge or floppy disk could not be changed. And because the internet was in its infancy back then, there was no infrastructure to change games after they released. Because it had to be an absolute certainty that a player could complete a game without major issues, this led to stringent quality assurance across the industry. Games were also simpler back then, which made finding and fixing bugs much easier. So because older games were simpler and evaluated more closely, more of their problems were fixed. This changed as physical media evolved. With the more space that games were allowed to take up on advancing physical mediums like CDs, the more complex they were allowed to be. And suddenly, by the mid-90s, it was becoming harder and harder to find and fix all of a game's problems. This is when the concept of a patch was born, an update that a developer could release on the internet that would overwrite data on an existing install of a computer game. In December of 1996, Blizzard Entertainment released Diablo version 1.0. On February 25, 1997, Blizzard released version 1.02, fixing many bugs. For a number of years, patches like this remained exclusive to PC gaming, due to older consoles lacking internet connectivity and front ends. That all changed with the Xbox and Xbox Live. The first console game to ever receive a patch was Epic's Unreal Championship for Xbox in 2003. As a fun aside, the IGN article that covered this patch ends with the following. While the idea of being able to fix bugs in a game is great, let's hope development studios don't make a habit of rushing out unfinished games. The last thing we all need is to have to download a new patch every few months. The availability of patches on all platforms finally gave every developer the channels to change games after they came out. But the concept of patches didn't necessarily change the standards for quality assurance, especially seeing as how QA had grown into a larger part of development to accommodate how much more difficult it'd become to playtest games. What did happen to QA was that it became more refined, and additional methods to track bugs were devised. Bug priority queues were always a part of development, but with games getting bigger, developers had to figure out what the most important bugs to fix for a game's release were and prioritize them. Now, the reason developers back in the mid-2000s still had to be so vigilant about game-breaking issues on console is because platform owners held them to that standard with a financial deterrent. Patching a game on console used to have a fee attached to it, and it wasn't cheap. Patching a game on Xbox used to cost $40,000. The problem that patching fees created was that independent developers could never patch their games because they simply couldn't afford to. Xbox's policy for updating games was also criticized by Valve's Gabe Newell and Eric Johnson in a 2010 interview, with Gabe calling the patching process on Xbox 360 a train wreck. So in 2013, Xbox announced that they were removing the fee to update a game, a rule that they still stand by to this day that became standard across the industry. Fast forward to today, and one can see how the advancement of technology, games getting harder to make, and the breaking down of the barriers to fix them after they released led us to where we are now, where game patches come out regularly. Unfinished games have been around forever, but previous industry standards created less of them because they were disincentivized, and games were a bit more straightforward to develop. That doesn't mean, however, that some didn't slip through the cracks. The most unfinished games I've personally ever played are from the early 2000s. That's because game dev, or more generally, software development, has always been very difficult. Developers are not infallible, and no matter how well a game is planned, problems can and will arise. The severity of those problems almost always shows in the final product. Unfinished games are everywhere today because no matter the era, humans aren't perfect. And when you combine the volatility of game development, the mandate to ship a product, and the loosening of quality standards, you're bound to get entities like corporations that abuse the rules or lack thereof. There's also no incentive for regulation because consumers keep paying for faulty products. I talked about bug queue, and at the top of the list is always crashes. Selling a game that can't even be played is a lawsuit waiting to happen, but almost everything else that doesn't impede your progress tremendously rightfully has a much lower priority. That's why we have unfinished games today that function, but certainly not optimally. And that brings us to an important question. How do you identify an unfinished game? It's easy to point to serious performance problems or bugs as obvious signs of something unfinished, but the reason those are obvious is because they can easily be correlated to an incomplete product. What I'm more interested in are the remnants left in a game when a feature or design element is cut. They're easily spotted and understood if you know what you're looking for. The new Life is Strange game was full of these signs, and without delving into any of the story, I'd like to go over a few of them and use the game as an example. To start, the most important question when analyzing a game is why. Most game mechanics and features have obvious reasons for existing that can be explained with an examination of the game. If you can't answer why a certain aspect of a game exists, it's typically because you lack a greater context that was stripped from the game by the developer when whatever would justify the existence of what you're trying to understand was removed. Furthermore, unfinished games aren't identified by a single issue. Poor performance and bugs are just initial potential signs that something went wrong during development. An unfinished game is always characterized by a pattern, a series of questions without answers. When I played Double Exposure, some of the questions I asked myself were, why does the game introduce timed responses in the opening segment and then almost never use them again in the rest of the game? Why is the camera mechanic so useless? Why does the game forego any player-driven scene transitions and always cut when it wants to move the character somewhere? Why does the outfit selection menu look like they made it in a week? Why, in a game set on a college campus, do we visit such few locations in it? Why can't I explore here? Why can't I explore here? Why does the cat DLC have less than 10 minutes of content? Why does the last third of the game take place in one location? Why doesn't the game have a real ending? And finally, why is this the worst optimized game of the year? You may look at Life is Strange as a franchise and think that some of these complaints aren't warranted given the scope of the rest of the games, but the degree to which Double Exposure is both linear and inconsiderate of the player's agency leads me to believe that the reason why there are so many obvious problems with it is because a lot was cut from the game. And what happens when you cut things? Well, nothing in a game exists in isolation. Mechanics, features, and story all work together. When you cut something, that means that anything that remains, which depends on that system, will have trouble making sense or working without it. All games have cut content, but how well the developer is able to maintain coherency as they bridge the remaining content is what makes the difference in our ability to notice it. Unfortunately, the more I played of Double Exposure, the more I realized how small and limited it was, and how any attempts to explore outside of its confines felt rebutted by the developers. So I decided to find my own answers. Typically, when a game nonsensically gates you from something, it's because it doesn't want you exploring what's beyond that. And it only took me a few seconds to understand why Double Exposure is so restricted. It's probably because if it wasn't, then you'd see how many areas the developer built that aren't used in the game. I wondered why the game never let the player transition scenes by themselves and why they're always magically teleported to all destinations. A great example is Max's cabin. You never go to Max's cabin. The game puts you in there. And why? Why does the game do this? It's because if you could leave, you'd see that there's a whole neighborhood along with the back of the campus that the game probably didn't finish. The way that you would reach this content is gated off by the most basic obstacles ever, and in some cases, the game literally turns the player back with no explanation whatsoever. If you venture further outside of these boundaries, you'll find roads and streets that would have connected certain locations, but they weren't finished, so they aren't used. And I believe that's why the player is teleported everywhere instead of having the agency to walk to locations like in the previous games. The most bizarre thing I found was a city that was probably used for some sort of testing. Ultimately, the rest of my questions can't be answered by analyzing the game itself. So the only thing left is baseless speculation about the developer and publisher that you shouldn't try to gain insight from because there's some things we just can't know. What I do know is that Life is Strange Double Exposure does not feel like a finished game. And there's one more external sign of that which I'd like to talk about, and that's the game's Switch port. I know that the Nintendo Switch is not the world's most advanced console by any stretch of the imagination. With that said, the port of Double Exposure has to be the worst looking AAA game I've ever seen. And how anyone looked at this and thought it was acceptable to release is unbelievable. Forget looking like the same game. This looks worse than the original Life is Strange. Now, to bring everything full circle, the reason I really wanted to talk about this port is because it currently has a bug where in Chapter 4, the game crashes and corrupts your save. There are people who have bought this game who cannot finish it. I find it incredibly hard to believe that a game-breaking problem found the day of the game's launch was not reported by QA. It almost certainly was, and despite the Switch port coming out almost a month after the other platforms, this was not fixed. And at the time of making this video, Square Enix says they're aware of the issue, but can't do anything. The saves are gone. Why do we tolerate this? In any other industry, if a product was faulty or otherwise didn't work, there's a chance it would be recalled. And once in a blue moon, something like that does happen in gaming. Everyone who bought Concord got refunds because the game no longer exists, despite being advertised as a live service. The only other time I can remember this happening is when the atrocious port of Arkham Knight was taken down from Steam. But otherwise, publishers get to put out garbage with near impunity. And the problem isn't just them. The platform owners aren't protecting us either. Sony, Xbox, Nintendo, Valve, and all the other PC storefronts aren't like the general consumer. The general consumer can be suckered by marketing and a concerted effort to conceal a game's more unfinished elements. There is no fooling the platform owners who have their own internal quality assurance and don't even allow titles to be shipped on their platforms without passing certification. I remember a lot of people thinking that Sony was the good guy for taking Cyberpunk 2077 off the PlayStation Store because of how broken it was at launch. But why did they sell it to you in the first place? Do you think they didn't know what the state of the game was? They knew. Everyone knew, except us. The general consumer, and to an equal extent, the creatives who worked on the game, are left holding the bag. The people with the least amount of power always get screwed. And that's not to say that developers can't mess up, or even that all consumer behavior is good. But if we're keeping count between normal people and shareholders who exert financial pressure to get games released when they shouldn't be, it's not even close. Something has to change. I don't know if change is going to come in the form of regulation, public or private, or if games like this will eventually become unprofitable because the industry is teaching consumers to not buy games on release. The future is nebulous. The only thing we can do is regulate ourselves, and that's hard to do. I get it. We want to play games, and boy are we capable of putting up with a lot. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves, are we part of the problem? Unfinished games are everywhere, but so are we, and no game can succeed without an audience willing to pay for it. Thanks for watching.